Welcome one and all to the Wilds of Eldraine presentation. I'm doing this in lieu of a traditional set review, but I just wanted to jot down my thoughts on the new cards from the set fairly quickly and just go over what I think is interesting and we'll probably see play in Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, etc. So, the obvious chase card of the set is Beseech the Mirror, and my pick for the best card in the set. It's a 4-mana triple black sorcery, which search your library for a card, exile it face down, then shuffle. If this spell was bargained, meaning you can sack an artifact, enchantment, or token as you cast it, as an additional cost to cast it, then you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost if that spell's mana value is 4 or less. And if you didn't bargain it, or if you searched for something that costs more than 4, you put it in your hand instead. So, this can obviously do a lot of things. It can be copies 5 through 8 of all of the various incredibly powerful 4-mana bombs in Modern, for example, or Pioneer, such as Sheoldred, Omnath, Karn, the One Ring. And note that Beseech the Mirror does cast the card, so you will get the One Ring's cast trigger when it enters. Or, rather than copies 5 through 8, it means you can reduce the amount of copies that you're playing in your main deck of all of those cards and use Beseech the Mirror as a way to essentially cut down on one specific card while playing more copies of all of the other cards. So now you can play more cards than you normally would. So for example, let's say you would normally not play Karn the Great Creator in your Omnath deck because, well, you have to play 4 copies of Omnath and then more Karns, and that's just too many 4-drops. Well, now Beseech the Mirror can become the additional copies of those cards instead. But Beseech the Mirror is more than just finding bombs in your deck, because Beseech the Mirror is a Swiss Army knife. It can go grab tons of different things, including various silver bullets and specific cards that you would never normally run. So for example, it can grab Chalice of the Void, Necromentia. You can play Living End in decks that normally wouldn't play Living End to counter your opponent's Living End. You can grab Amulet of Vigor out of Amulet Titan if you reconfigure the mana base to play more black sources, or just use Dryad of the Elysian Grove to fix for it. There's tons and tons and tons of cards that you can use that you normally would never be able to use because of Beseech the Mirror. And people have been talking about its uses in Legacy by combining it with Gaia's Will to essentially create a Storm deck, since now you get to play Yogg Will via Beseech the Mirror into Gaia's Will. So, obviously the big downside is the triple black cost, which you do have to find a way to be able to pay for, and the bargain cost, meaning you need cheap artifacts, enchantments, or tokens that you can use to pay for the bargain, preferably ones that are cheap and replace themselves. So what are the best options? So you have them kind of broken into a few categories. There's the ones that have an immediate value on entering, and these are cards like Abundant Growth and Spreading Seas that just draw a card immediately, and then you don't really need them to hang around, so you can sack them to the bargain for Beseech the Mirror. And notably, some of the benefits of Abundant Growth is that it helps you fix for the triple black in Beseech the Mirror. Or you can go with cards that have death triggers when you sack them to Beseech the Mirror. So Ichor Wellspring, Chromatic Star, and Hatching Plans, which I believe is going to get a lot more value now that Beseech the Mirror exists. Or you can play cards that incidentally create tokens, so things like Blood Tithe Harvester, Samwise Gamgee, or the Dwarven Mine or Gingerbread Cabin that are fetchable via the land base. Now, it is a bit awkward that Gingerbread Cabin and Dwarven Mine require you to run many mountains or forests, and Beseech the Mirror requires that you have triple black to pay for it, but I'm sure there's a way around it, and you could figure out a mana base that would work between all the various shocks and triomes that exist. So moving on from Beseech the Mirror, we have the various adventure cards in the set. Now, adventure cards do a couple of things, or many things actually, because of their ability to have one card that is split into 2 different types, and one card that has one half of it being expensive, but the other half being cheap. Usually, the main front half of the card, meaning the main card itself, like the enchantments here, are the expensive ones, and the adventures are the cheaper ones, although that's not always the case. So we've already had adventures from the original Eldraine, so what do adventures enable us to do? Well, they enable you to cheat and skirt the costs of various restrictions like the Cascade cards. So you can play cards that you can technically cast for cheaper than 3 mana in your Cascade deck. Same goes for the Karuga decks that are usually shown in Pioneer. We've also seen the Possibility Storm deck in Pioneer, where you run cards that are a specific type, like Lovestruck Beast, to tutor for Enter the Infinite and combo off that way, while technically not having any sorceries in your deck. the same way how modal double-faced lands allow you to play Charbelcher. And then we have cards like Glimpse of Tomorrow, where you can have cheapo spells on the adventure side, but then when you actually cascade into the cards via Glimpse of Tomorrow, they are bigger, more valuable permanents. So what's the problem with the adventure spells in Wilds of Eldraine? Well, it's that they're just not as good as the adventure spells that we already have. So the original Eldraine was incredibly powerful, and Brazen Borrower, Bonecrusher Giant, and to a lesser extent Lovestruck Beast in primarily Pioneer have pretty much set the bar for the power level of adventure spells. And while there are some alright to decent adventure spells in Wilds of Eldraine, I don't think any of them hold a candle to these cards. So moving on, we have Rowan, Sign of War, and Will, Sign of Peace, and these are 3 mana legendary creatures that have an ability where you tap and then reduce the costs of the specific colors that they are from the spells that you cast later in the turn, either based on losing life from Rowan or gaining life from Will. So there's a couple of aspects to these cards that we need to look at. The first is going to be, what can you do to lose or gain life at a cheap enough rate that you can reasonably have the abilities go off? The second is going to be, what are the payoffs for those cards? You also need to consider whether it's worthwhile to play a 3 mana creature that has no immediate impact when it hits the board, and if any of that is consistent. So, in terms of payoffs, there's tons of different things you could use. So in like the black decks with Rowan, you could play Torment of Hailfire, Exsanguinate, any number of fireball spells, X spells, or just big black payoffs. In blue and white for Rowan or for Will, same deal, Omniscience, any number of gigantic big payoffs. The payoffs are not really the issue. The issue is going to be getting there. So in Will's case, there are a number of cheap high life gain cards. Cards like Chaplain's Blessing, Hero's Reunion, Rest for the Wary. These are cheap cards that you can play the turn after Will comes down, gain a bunch of life, and reduce the costs of all the spells that you cast later, either casting multiple spells for really cheap or one big payoff for really cheap. And in Rowan's case, it's even easier because you, of course, have the Fetch Shock mana bases of Modern, which can enable that for free. You can also enable it for free with Street Wraith. And there's just various other things that incidentally lose you life on the cheap, like Thoughtseize and a multitude of other cards. So the main issue here is going to be, can you play a 3 mana creature, whether that be in Modern or Pioneer, that has no impact when it hits the board? You need to play the card. It has no impact on turn 3. It needs to survive, so it can't get hit by removal. You then need 2 additional cards in your hand. You need something that will enable the cost reduction, so Fetch Shockland or a life gain spell, and then you need the payoff as well. And in my estimation, this is too many hoops to jump through, but they definitely are powerful effects. If they were going to see play, I would bet on Rowan in Modern because of Fetch Shocklands, but I'm leaning towards neither of them actually being able to see play. So moving on, we have Talion, the Kindly Lord. This is a 4 mana 3/4 legend with flying, and as it enters, you choose a number between 1 and 10. Whenever an opponent casts a spell with mana value, power, or toughness equal to the chosen number, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. So Talion initially intrigued me because it's kind of similar to Sheoldred. It's a 4 mana black bomb that causes your opponent to lose life, and in this case you draw cards instead of gaining life, which seems to be a better effect. Now obviously the number that you're going to choose is usually going to be somewhere between 0 and 2. So the main question with Talion was going to be, is this better than just playing Sheoldred, first of all? And then the second part is, what number do you name and how consistent is that number? So first, Talion is worse than Sheoldred in a number of ways, the main one being the stat line, where in Modern it doesn't survive Fury, whereas Sheoldred does. And that stat line is going to be relevant not just in Fury's case, but in various other cases, but Fury's the one that mainly comes to mind. Then the second part of Talion is the ability. So yes, obviously you're choosing somewhere between 0 and 2. And so the main question here was, how consistent is that? So first of all, Pioneer, not consistent enough. Pioneer's mana values are all over the place, and while there are certainly decks like Humans and other aggro decks that are playing a lot of cheap spells, there's also a lot of decks like Nykthos, Lotus Field, and more mid-range value decks that are playing mana values all over the place. It's probably not too consistent there. Now, if you look at Modern, here are the top 10 decks by meta percent in Modern. So the question is, how often will this actually trigger? So here's the percentages. So for decks like the Cascade decks, Tron, Omnath, and Amulet Titan, the mana values are too varied, or there are not enough cards centered in a specific mana value to where Talion will still trigger sometimes, but not anywhere near enough for it to matter. And now for the other decks like Scam, Burn, Yawgmoth, Hammer, and Murktide, you're going to be naming between 1 or 2, depending on which deck you're playing against. But even in those circumstances, you're only hitting 50% of their spells. So the main question is the trigger only going off 50% of the time worthwhile? And to me, I don't think it is. I think it's too slow at that point. Your opponent can simply not cast spells at those values at a certain point in the game, or can choose to cast other spells. It's just a problem that it's only going off roughly 50% of the time. So moving on, we have some of the less impactful but still relevant cards to talk about. So Not Dead After All is a black instant. Until end of turn, target creature you control gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control, then create a Wicked Roll token attached to it, which is an enchantment token that gives the creature +1/+1, and when the aura is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So this is obviously a strict upgrade to Feign Death and or Undying Malice in the Scam decks. So the Scam decks in Modern play 6 copies of the Scam spells, so usually it's 3 each of Feign Death and Undying Malice, so Not Dead After All obviously just slots in and replaces 4 of those cards. Not anything hugely impactful, but it is strictly better than those. Then a card that's been often talked about is Moonshaker Cavalry, because it's obviously very similar to Craterhoof Behemoth. So it's an 8 mana creature, 6/6 flyer. When it enters, creatures you control gain flying and get +X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. So obviously people look at that and go, wow, it's like the white Craterhoof Behemoth. But I think it's worse than Craterhoof in a number of important ways that'll prevent it from seeing play. So the first one is haste. The haste on Craterhoof is extremely relevant. A lot of times you are giving haste to Craterhoof and you're either exclusively only attacking with Craterhoof, or you're attacking with Craterhoof and a few other creatures, and it's that combination of damage that is going to be lethal. Now obviously Moonshaker Cavalry is harder to block in that flying is probably going to get more damage in general than Trample will, but that's not a huge difference. The haste is the big divider here. Secondly, Craterhoof is just in better colors. So in Legacy, you have Natural Order, which can just go tutor Craterhoof into play for free, but you also have decks like Elves or just other ramp decks in green that enable you to burst out tons and tons of mana to play Craterhoof Behemoth. And there are just other green spells aside from Natural Order that cheat things into play or produce tons of mana. So Craterhoof is more castable or more cheatable in green decks than Moonshaker Cavalry is in white decks. So moving on, we have Sleight of Hand. Now, Sleight of Hand is not a new card, but it's being printed into a standard legal set, which makes it Pioneer legal, and therefore it can show up in Pioneer decks. So similar to how Modern just got an upgrade in Preordain being unbanned, Sleight of Hand is going to be an upgrade for any deck that was interested in blue cantrips in Pioneer. So it's probably going to instantly slot into Arclight Phoenix and Jeskai Ascendancy and just any other blue cantrip deck. We've got Regal Bunnycorn, which is a 2 mana white creature that has power and toughness equal to the number of non-land permanents you control. So it counts itself, so it is at least a 1/1. And then it grows based on how many permanents you have. The permanents notably don't just have to be creatures. So people have been comparing this essentially as the white Tarmogoyf, because it's kind of similar. And then we will come back to Regal Bunnycorn in a bit, but I'm going to group it with this other card, Werefox Bodyguard. It's a 3 mana white creature, 2/2 with flash. When it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 other target non-fox creature, which is going to be pretty much everything other than itself, until it leaves the battlefield. And you can pay 2 mana and sack it to gain 2 life. So this is the first flash Oblivion Ring creature that we've seen. So we've had cards like Brutal Cathar before, but this is the first one that has flash. So Regal Bunnycorn and Werefox Bodyguard do seem pretty good. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is they're the wrong creature type. So the only premier white aggro deck, which is what Regal Bunnycorn and Werefox Bodyguard would want to go in, is mono white humans and Pioneer. And that deck specifically needs all its creatures to be humans, for the most part, to get buffed by Thalia's Lieutenant primarily, and Coppercoat Vanguard as well. So when you have 8 lords that all care about humans, any creatures that you play that aren't humans are drastically reduced in value. And that's really the main problem with Bunnycorn and Werefox Bodyguard. So if there winds up being a different deck that is not human tribal, that would want white aggressive creatures like those, then they can show up. But as of right now, humans doesn't want them. and humans is the only current white aggro deck. Now, it's possible they could see play in like the green-white Coco decks that aren't human-based, but I don't know how great they are in there either. They're probably fine. So moving on, we have a Stroke of Midnight. Now, this is not a strict upgrade to Generous Gift, so the main differences here are that Stroke of Midnight gives the opponent a 1/1 instead of a 3/3, but it can't hit lands. Now, Generous Gift doesn't really see play anywhere outside of maybe EDH, so Stroke of Midnight, I guess, is not too relevant. Maybe it becomes worthwhile somewhere, but essentially is another Generous Gift. So if you were already in the market for a Generous Gift, here's another one. We've got Elvish Archivist, which is a 2-mana 0/1 green creature, and it says whenever one or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control, put 2/+1 counters on it, but the ability only triggers once a turn. And whenever one or more enchantments enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card, and the ability only triggers once a turn. So, it's a value card, but you can't snowball with it, so it's an incremental value card over multiple turns. It's a bit awkward that it cares about either or type, so it's either going to grow based on artifacts or draw cards based on enchantments, but there are some fairly cheap ways that you can get it to trigger. So there's obviously tons and tons of ways to produce cheap artifacts, notably food tokens would be one that immediately comes to mind, and there are enchantment decks. And it is interesting that Urza's Saga is an enchantment that entering the battlefield causes Archivist to trigger, so it can draw a card for free in that sense. So I don't know if this card will show up anywhere, but here are just some ideas to get it going. So then we've got Break the Spell. White instant, destroy target enchantment. If a permanent you controlled or a token was destroyed this way, draw a card. And I primarily am interested in this for Hatching Plans. So if Hatching Plans winds up being a card that is good enough because of Beseech the Mirror's Bargain or just other bargain cards, then you can maybe play Break the Spell, and then you can combine Break the Spell with Hatching Plans to draw 4. Probably still not good enough. It's more relevant if you're looking to specifically hit enchantments, and then you can incidentally hit your own stuff. There's also maybe other enchantments that matter with it, like Treacherous Blessing, that you can blow up with Break the Spell, so that's another thought, but I thought it's cheap enough, it draws a card potentially, it's worth including. So then we have Brave the Wilds is a green sorcery, and it says, you search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. And if you bargained the Brave the Wilds, target land you control becomes a 3/3 elemental creature with haste that's still a land. So this is the cheapest spell we've ever had that turns a land into a creature, and which is specifically great with Jeskai Ascendancy. Now, the main problem here is going to be, what do you bargain with it in Jeskai Ascendancy decks? Because Jeskai Ascendancy decks typically are not playing anything that you could bargain except for Jeskai Ascendancy itself, although there are artifact versions of the Jeskai Ascendancy deck, such as the non-green Jeskai Ascendancy deck in Pioneer, although again, that deck isn't green. So you would need to find ways of playing most likely cheap artifacts in order to have something to bargain for Brave the Wilds. So we have Back for Seconds. This card is kind of similar to Beseech the Mirror in that it's doing something that we haven't seen before. So 3 mana sorcery, return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, but if you bargained it, you can put one of them that costs 4 or less onto the battlefield instead. How useful is reanimating specifically a 4-drop directly onto the battlefield? I'm not sure. Obviously, this is in black, and the creature that immediately comes to mind is Sheoldred. There could be other possibilities. Is this worth it? You have to be playing a deck that's playing a lot of creatures to begin with so that you can get 2 cards back, and then this is obviously more of a grindy card. It's also possible that you can do self-mill or reanimation shenanigans, although again, you can only get something back that costs 4 or less, but this card does seem to have enough value behind it. It's just a matter of, is there a shell that wants it? So then we have Royal Treatment and Water Wings. So Royal Treatment is a 1 mana green instant, and it says target creature you control gains hexproof until end of turn, and you create a Royal Roll token attached to it, which means is a Royal Roll token is an enchantment token that gives the creature +1/+1 and ward 1. And then Water Wings is a 2 mana blue instant that says until end of turn, target creature you control has base power and toughness 4/4 and gains flying and hexproof. So the place I see these cards, if they're going to show up anywhere, is Infect. Infect is always interested in cards that pump their creatures and give their creatures hexproof. Both of these cards do both of those. So the only question is, are these cards good enough? And if so, what are they replacing? The card that's most similar to Royal Treatment is Blossoming Defense, which gives more of a boost in power and toughness, but is only temporary, whereas Royal Treatment's +1 is permanent. Water Wings is similar to, I guess the card that it's similar to is it's kind of a fusion between Vines of Vastwood and Distortion Strike, where it's giving the creature hexproof, but also flying, so it's hard to block, and pumping it. I think it's probably better than either Vines or Distortion Strike, although I don't know if it replaces either or both of those outright. But again, I think both of these cards have a pretty good shot of seeing play in Infect. So then there's Toadstool Admirer. Now this is a single green mana 1/1. It has Ward 2 and 4 mana, put a +1 counter on it. So the main thing here is its use in the Pioneer Boggles decks. So right now, Slippery Boggle is not legal in Pioneer, which leaves Pioneer only having a single 1 mana creature with Hexproof in Glade Cover Scout. The other creatures typically show up in those decks is either Saiba Cryptomancer, which is 2 mana, or cards that don't have Hexproof at all, like Light Paws and SRAM, just to try to get value out of them. So Toadstool Admirer is the closest thing we've got to a second Hexproof creature, and while Ward 2 is not Hexproof, it is close enough to it that it's going to be hard to kill. You know, you can't Fatal Push this, for example, until turn 3 at least. So maybe this can show up there. Then we've got Lich Knight's Conquest. This is a 5 mana sorcery that says sacrifice any number of artifacts, enchantments, and or tokens and return that many creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if I can see this anywhere, it would be as a 1 of target for Bring to Light. We don't have any like multiple reanimation spell at this low of a cost in Pioneer. The main issue here is that in Bring to Light decks, they're typically not playing that many creatures. They usually will have some number of Omnath, Elesh Norn, and Niv Mizzets, so they'll have some creatures, but not that many. But this is a card where if you're playing a particularly grindy game, like let's say against Rakdos Midrange or something, and you're going to be trading lots of creatures, you could potentially reanimate multiple bombs out in the late game. Now, again, a problem is this card doesn't have bargain written on it, but it basically has bargain, so you do need a fair number of things to sack to it. But Bring to Light decks are often also playing a bunch of random enchantments and whatnot that you can probably wind up sacking for this. So then there's fairies. Now, the set is introducing a bunch of fairy tribal cards, and a lot of players have gotten excited because of, you know, fairy tribal. Fairy tribal hasn't existed in Modern for quite some time. So the question is, are the fairy cards good enough for Modern? And I'm gonna say, no, they're not. So Abira is probably the best one, and even it is almost certainly not good enough for Modern, and the other ones aren't even close. So I do not foresee a return to fairies being good. So we got Emodane's Recruiter. This is a 3 mana 2/2 that when it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. It also has an adventure mode that's not really relevant. This just joins the list of other creatures that when they enter give all your guys haste. So it's either a replacement for something like Flamekin Zealot if you're ever going to use a deck like that, or it is a essentially 9th through 12th copy of Bushwhacker potentially if you were going to play a Bushwhacker deck. So Modern, it's probably too expensive, and since you already have 8 Bushwhackers anyway, Pioneer only has 1 Bushwhacker, so this is a maybe card. Maybe it can show up in like Boros Pia, for example. It's worth discussing. Next is Hopeless Nightmare, and this card is a 1 mana black enchantment that says when it enters, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life, and when this enchantment dies, you scry 2, and you can pay 3 to sack it. So this card only can possibly see place in one spot, and that's in the black burn decks in Modern. If you were to think about it, this is essentially the equivalent of red sorcery, target opponent takes 2 damage and discards a card. Would Burn play a card that was a shock to the face that also caused the opponent to discard? They probably would. So this card is the equivalent of that in Blackburn. Now, is Blackburn a good deck? Well, it's not as good as regular Burn, but it is a deck that's been showing up. So again, this is gonna probably show up in that deck. Then we've got Mighty Mouse here. The Savannah Lions power creep continues, and we have a 1 mana 2/1 that also has a sorcery adventure for a single mana that says target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater this turn. Is this card actually any good? Again, I'm gonna say no. It's the wrong creature type. The only white aggro deck is essentially humans, and this is not a human. The fact that it is 2 different spells in one does allow you to trigger stuff like Ledger Shredder and Clarion Spirit. I still think that's probably not good enough though. You would need a lot more things that trigger off of spells. If there's a white prowess deck, maybe it would be good enough, like a white heroic or prowess deck, then this card could be good enough. Those don't really exist at the moment either, but it's worth keeping in mind. So then we have Grabby Giant. Now, the only reason I bring this up is because the instant side of it at 2 mana is create a treasure token. Now, we already have Strike It Rich to create a treasure token for cheaper, but if you're playing a deck that wants to create a treasure token, and for some reason you can't afford to play cards that technically cost less than 3, then this can work for that. So for example, maybe the Glimpse of Tomorrow Cascade deck wants this, since it's a thing that lets you ramp / put an extra permanent into play that doesn't break the restriction on Cascade. And then the 4 mana side of the card is not great, but is okay. There's Picklock Prankster. This is a 2 mana 1/3 creature that has Flying and Vigilance, but more importantly, it has an adventure that costs 2 mana at an instant and says mill 4, then put an instant sorcery or fairy card from among the milled cards into your hand. We've seen cards like Philology Archaeologist show up before, cards that self-mill you and get a card back. This is probably worse than that, and that the card that you can get back is more restrictive, and the adventure side is not a creature that can actually block your opponent's creatures, but you do get to see 4 cards, put 4 cards into the graveyard for things like Treasure Cruise and Pioneer, and pick among the cards. Then we have Dogatui. I don't actually have anything to say about this card. It's not actually good. I just thought it was neat. And that brings us to the end of the set review. So those are all the cards I thought were interesting and worth discussing in Wilds of Eldraine. The big takeaway is going to be Beseech the Mirror, and then everything else might see play somewhere, but Beseech the Mirror is going to be the big format shaker. So if you're watching this on YouTube, I thank you for the support. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I will give a thank you now to all of my supporters on Patreon.